Hi everyone, welcome to the community classroom. We're going to have a discussion about who are the KHAZARS or the HAZARS. This ethnic group pops up in a number of conversations, and the history of the people is again shrouded in mystery. You always have these groups that are shrouded in mystery, and usually when there is a shrouded in mystery dynamic, as soon as you hear that, you should know that there is probably a conquest dynamic going on. And so when the people are dispersed or they are conquered, their history then gets confused, because then you have the colonizers or the conquerors coming in, taking over and recreating history. So remember, the winner usually gets to rewrite the history. And before we get started, I just want to point out that you will notice that a number of themes related to conflict and confusion going on even in the world today, somehow they tend to trace back to some sort of relationship with the groups of people identified under Noah, which would be Abram, Lot, Isaac, Ishmael, Jacob, and Esau. And so we're going to carry on, but the Khazar dynamic is also related to this particular family cluster. Now, what's important to note is that when you look at that Eurasian area, you'll see that there is a lot of mixing and conflation going on with all of these different ethnic groups, and they are so closely situated. Historically, they were so closely situated that there is perhaps a lot of overlap in terms of genetics, in terms of intermarriage. And so this also creates a lot of identity confusion. And it may seem like people are appropriating identities, but what might be happening is that you have that conquest dynamic going on, and then that intermarrying dynamic going on, and then you have people with mixed identities, and they may hold on to one identity more than the other. It's sort of like sometimes people are closer to their father or their mother's side of the family, and this may be what's going on here. So as noted, the Khazars are an ancient Eurasian group. We're just going to start with a few depictions of people who have been identified as potentially either being Khazars or being associated with Khazars by descent. And here's yet another depiction of individuals identified with Khazar identity. And what you will notice, as with a number of collectives historically in that Caucasus region, is that you'll see different phenotypes, even though you might be talking about the same cultural group. And so you see a lot of diversity in terms of skin color, sometimes in terms of hair texture, and this is a manifestation of this. And here's another depiction of people who are associated with historically the group known as Khazars. And here you have a number of individuals, a more modern depiction, but these individuals also have been perhaps associated with this Khazar identity. And you can see the phenotype similarities between all of these groups. And here you see some additional individuals who are associated with that area, and you can see again some of that diversity of phenotype. This analysis actually started off with an analysis of the dispersion of the surname Khazar. And what came up in looking at this dispersion of the surname Khazar was that an alternative spelling was noted, and it was Hazar. And this makes sense because you will often find these additions of letters that just basically create confusion, and that's what you have with that K. And this may also be the case when you have a Khan and you see that KH at the beginning of Khan. It may be simply Han, but you have that K there again, creating all sorts of confusion. But at any rate, so you can see here that the Khazar surname, according to forebears, is distributed in that area, which is Iran. And then you also see the Hazar name, many more people here, but more widely distributed. And you also see this name popping up in Turkey. Again, we're talking about a similar geographic area where you're talking about that Eurasian area over there. We're talking about that what you would consider the Middle Eastern area. So there is significant migration going on there. But this is important to note that this is an alternative spelling for this particular group of people. And that way you can expand your research if you were trying to better understand who the KHAZARS or the HAZARS actually are. And here you see Hazar coming out of a number of languages. What this means is that these people with these languages, they had some realization that these people existed. And so therefore you see this alternative translation of this name. And you can see there's a variety there in terms of this particular name. What stands out is that in some instances you don't have that Z, you actually have a J. And of course that stands out because the J sound in English in particular, this is a new letter that has appeared. And so this would take a little bit of analysis if someone wants to undertake that to get a handle on all of the possible variations of this particular name. But here you have a representative of this name in the Hindi language, Tibetan. So you have a little diversity here, and so it suggests some dispersion of this group. And here you see more of that J replacing the Z. Here you see these translations or these transliterations of Khazar in a number of languages, including Georgian and Russian. And then you see in the Russian, you see that alternative with that Hazar. Now, when you look at that spelling with the H versus the KH, you'll notice that there is a group of people identified by this title. What's important here is that KHAZARS were supposed to be extinct, or they disappeared. They don't know what happened to them. And then there is also the assertion that a number of groups who identify as Jew or Jewish, that their ancestry is rooted in Khazaria. And of course, this is highly possible because you are talking about an area where there again is significant migration, and you're talking about hundreds, perhaps thousands of years ago. In some of these instances of talking about these various groups mixing and mingling with each other. So moving right along here, you see in Britannica that this group of people known by this name without the K, they are possibly of Mongol descent, and that more recently they dwelled in an area in central Afghanistan. And here is one depiction of that particular group. It's also noted that they are under some significant pressure, and that there are some genocidal dynamics going on with this particular group of people. Now, the Jewish Virtual Library offers some information related to the Khazars and identify them as a group of the general Turkic type. This is important to note. As soon as you see things like type and ish, there is a suggestion that you're not talking about the original, you're talking about something that is in the likeness of. But you also see here that in this virtual library that there is that analysis, interpretation of this name without the K. And you see that in the Arabic. You also see that there's a variation in the Hebrew, the Greek, and the Chinese. And it says that the name has been explained as having derived from this idea of wandering and being a nomad. Also want to point out that in the Jewish Virtual Library, there is an indication that there are different phenotypes for the Khazars. And you see that there are white Khazars and black Khazars. This is consistent with the history of that Caucasus region. There is a heavy presence of both groups in terms of phenotype, and there may not have been this distinction that is placed on people now. And so the phenotype distinction might not have been that important back then, but of course it is something that is used to manipulate and divide people at this point in time. But again, it's important to point out because people often think that those in that region are the prototype for what is considered Caucasian or what is considered white. And the Jewish Virtual Library goes on to indicate that there was a conversion of the KHAZARS in the 700 time period. And so there appears to also be a conversion of the same group of people to Islam. What is noted is that you will often see these collectives being together and traveling together, and those individuals are those identified in terms of religious affiliation as Muslim and Jew. This is interesting because you often hear about all of this conflict. That conflict may be more recent than it is ancient. And so you also see this when you're talking about the expulsions out of Portugal and Spain. The expulsion was basically collectively those individuals identified as Muslim and those individuals identified as Jew. And there is the strong possibility that you're talking about the same groups of people in terms of genetics. However, the distinguishing feature is the religion. So you will see things like Moorish person in Spain or Portugal and Jewish person in Spain or Portugal. And you are talking about an adjective and a noun dynamic. And so you're talking about the religion of these particular groups of people versus an actual genetic distinction. It's like you can have one family and you can have different family members of different religions. And this may be why you had the Moors and Jews, the Moranos, the Moriscos, the Lancados, constantly traveling together. They probably are the exact same people, but because there is so much mystery shrouding that whole identity of Moor and Moorish, and this is probably intentional, it's very difficult to get a handle on who all of these people are. But it is well noted that they tend to travel as a pack, and there had to be a reason for that. And we're just going to look at some of the dynamics related to the ending of that word, azar, khazar, hazar. And you can see that in the Persian calendar that this is actually a month. And it's also related to this idea of fire. And here you have another interesting notation with respect to this Zara or Zera. And with this one, you see that it is related to this idea of sowing seed, pregnancy, yielding seed, conceiving, bearing. You also have another definition of this Zara, and in this instance, it means a loathsome thing. And Strong's Concordance goes on to indicate that it is related to this idea of estrangement and also disgust and loathsome. Here you have another interpretation of Zara, and this particular time you see it related to the son of Judah and Tamar. And here you see a little bit more information about the etymology of Zara or Zerah. As we wrap this up, we have covered some of the history of the name and the people group known as KHAZARS, and we've looked at the possibilities that might explain their history and its connection to individuals known as both Jews and Moors. And so this might give you a little bit of food for thought for your own research going forward, and also in helping to explain how you have these groups being conflated and some of these naming dynamics. And even with the names, you can see the dispersion of these groups over time. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.